Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument, hosted by the militant, Marxist, anti-Santa, Martin Bradbury. The Bradbury Group is streamed live on Rover, Sky TV, YouTube and Facebook. Proudly sponsored by Watea, journalism you can trust. Let the arguments begin.
Kia ora Aotearoa. The true demarcation of power in a late-stage capitalism, liberal, progressive democracy is the 1% richest plus their 9% enablers versus the 90% rest of us. Welcome to the Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument. I'm your host, the editor of the daily blog, Martin Bradbury. Bomber to my comrades, Mr. Bradbury if you're nasty. My pronouns are us and we. Coming up on this evening's show, the political panel all-stars tonight are law professor Jane Kelsey, NZ Herald columnist Simon Wilson, and Claudette Hawati, Watea's press gallery journalist. We did have Fran O'Sullivan lined up for this evening. However, she pulled out 30 minutes ago because she's very ill. We love you, Fran. Hope you get better soon. Tonight's one-on-one in 10 is Labour Party leader Chris Hipkins. Before all that, however, is this week's War on News. Just when you didn't think the school lunches fiasco could get any worse, the School Lunch Collective has started using a 25% cheaper offal mince blend for school lunches without telling anyone. Lung and liver tacos with special brain meat might be cheaper, but I'm not sure the kids are going to enjoy the flavour. How did we manage to take healthy, nutritious school lunches designed by Labour and end up with offal burgers smothered in ground up heart gravy? What will David Seymour serve our kids up next? Hoof surprise, snout pot luck, or horse nachos? Sure, offal mince might be cheaper and a couple of grades up from what you'd feed your pet, but if David Seymour got his way, he'd give hungry kids semi-automatic rifles and a packet of pseudo-effigen before he'd actually feed them, just to teach their parents a lesson about not having kids they can't afford. Seymour running the school lunches is a little bit like Darth Vader opening a kindergarten. Talking of offal mince, David Seymour is now threatening to use the fast-track powers to create a new branch of supermarkets, to which I say, oi, you, no. We've all just seen what he's done to the kids' school lunches. Do you really want him anywhere near supermarkets? We are already price gouged by Countdown and New World and Slack and Slave. I don't want jelly meat casserole specials or fish fingers made out of real fish fingers. If ACT had their way, they would allow supermarkets to harvest human organs and sell your pets for soup. Just because the free market can do it doesn't mean it should. And finally, in this week's War on News, headline after headline after headline has covered the catastrophic flooding in the top of the South Island, but no one is mentioning nor connecting climate change to these events. While we are working so hard to ignore why this flooding is occurring, we are also ignoring the fact that National took $2.4 billion out of the Climate Emergency Response Fund and had done bugger all in terms of preparing for more climate change. This government's solutions seem to be more mining, more roads, and more cows. Brothers and sisters, we're all going to die on a burning planet thanks to the lies of the petro-industrial complex and their polluter mates. To quote the great Mike Hosking, happy days. The political panel all-stars up shortly, Fano. But first, this week's one-on-one in 10 with leader of the Labour Party, Chris Hipkins. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being available to the Fourth Estate. Your democracy is grateful.
Very good to be here, Bobber. Great to talk to you.
Chippy, can we start, please, with the current COVID inquiry? I believe, passionately, that you, Jacinda, Grant, and your team did an incredible job during a once-in-a-century pandemic. I believe you led with honour and courage to put public health ahead of profit margins. Of course, there were mistakes because it was an unprecedented event, but the revisionist history, led by the likes of Ryan Bridge, Paddy Gower and Sir Ian Taylor playing Captain Hindsight must really grind your gears. What do you say to those who would so cheaply diminish our collective lockdown sacrifice?
I think we have to recognise that it was a really tough time for the country. So, yes, I think our pandemic response was really successful in keeping people alive, which, of course, is the number one metric in a pandemic, keeping people alive. But also, I think what does get lost in this is we had fewer days of lockdown in New Zealand than in a whole lot of the other countries we compare ourselves to. But we shouldn't discount that if you lost a loved one during that time, or your business went broke during that time, or you had other things that affected you, it was really, really tough. And so I want to make sure that this Royal Commission actually isn't about the politicians or politicians pursuing a political agenda. It should be about giving people the opportunity to talk about how the pandemic might have affected them, how we can do it better next time, because there will be a next time. And undoubtedly, when you have the benefit of 2020 hindsight, there are going to be things that could have been improved, and we do need to capture those. But I hope we can do that in a way that it doesn't just become a political kind of shoving exercise, but actually becomes one about how do we do this better if we have to do it again.
Preach. The manner in which those sacked by the mandates, they had to stand down before they received welfare, and the fact that many couldn't get their jobs back after the mandates ended up making many of those Kiwis feel othered in a way that was probably unique to them, and they have been embittered ever since. What lessons must future governments set when dealing with those who, for whatever reason, don't want a vaccine?
Look, I think the first Royal Commission actually was quite right in describing our COVID response as a game of two halves. And I think the reason it was a game of two halves is in the first part of our response, which was the first sort of year and a half to nearly almost 2 years, we had huge amounts of public support for what we were doing. People were right behind it. There was a huge amount of collective commitment to doing the right thing. And I think once we got to the period around vaccination, we do have to recognise that that was when the social bonds that had held us together for 2 years really did start to stray. I have to say vaccination was some of the hardest stuff that we worked through as a government, because it's often, you look back on this now and it's easy to forget what else was going on at the time. You had people saying, we're not going to go to work unless everybody in our workplace has been vaccinated. You had parents saying, we're not going to send our kids to school unless teachers have been vaccinated. You had people saying, I'm a nurse or a doctor, I don't want to be seeing people who haven't been vaccinated. So there was a lot of pressure, and it was such a difficult balancing exercise for the government to navigate through. And, if I have one regret, it was the fact that we did lose that social cohesion during that time.
Auckland in the last lockdown did the heavy lifting so that the rest of New Zealand could get vaccinated. We sacrificed a hell of a lot to make the rest of New Zealand safer. Did Auckland deserve to be thanked better for that sacrifice?
I think there's, in retrospect, there's some things that we should have done. We should have actually been, when the boundary was removed and when the lockdown ended for Auckland, we should have had the whole government in Auckland on the ground talking to people about how they'd been affected by it. What did we need to do to kickstart things again? Because I think that kind of getting things moving again in Auckland was too slow once the restrictions were moved. When I look back on it now, and I talked to the first Royal Commission about this, you get a lot of advice when the pandemic starts on this is how you successfully manage a pandemic. The bit where the advice is patchy is what do you do when you get to the other end of it? And I think that is the bit that we've got the biggest lessons to learn from, is how you kind of get back to normal. Because that was the bit that I think was really challenging for us. We struggled to get things back to normal again.
Let's talk economy. Centrix reported this month that 758 construction businesses have gone into liquidation in the last 12 months, thanks in part to the government's freeze on transport, housing and hospital investment spending at the beginning of 2024, meaning construction jobs have fallen by 12,723 in the last year, while 30,000 Kiwis have left New Zealand. This government believes if you amputate the state, the market will step in and do it cheaper. How's that ideological experiment working out for Kiwis?
Well, exactly. And I think your numbers are a bit conservative there, Bomber. It's about 15,000 fewer jobs in building and construction if you go back to election day. And actually, it's something like 180,000 New Zealanders overall have left since the election. It's just the government talk about the net figures. So that, we have a whole lot of people leave and then more people come in. But actually, surely we want to create a situation where people who are already here want to stay here. I think I've got the number here. It's 47,300 Kiwis have given up in the last year and gone to Australia. Come on. We want to keep these people here in New Zealand. And what does that involve? It involves getting the basics right, like jobs, health, homes, real action on the cost of living. Remember when, Christopher Luxon was challenged during the election campaign about the fact that he promised families with kids $250 a fortnight. Well, a year and a half in, he cannot identify one single family that's received the full $250 a fortnight that he promised them.
Bernard Hickey reports that the services sector joined the manufacturing sector in contracting in June. BNZ downgraded its Q2 GDP forecast to a contraction, while Stats New Zealand also reported yesterday another 0.2% fall in total spending with electronic cards in June, which means retail sales have fallen 7.5% in inflation-adjusted terms in the last 2 years. Where is the economic growth we were promised from this government?
Well, the government don't seem to have a plan to generate economic growth, but they also don't seem willing to acknowledge that what they're doing is making things worse and not better. So, Nicola Willis seems to think that businesses on Lambton Quay going under is because people are working from home, let alone the fact that she's laid off thousands of people. And perhaps that's actually the reason people aren't out and about and on Lambton Quay spending money, because if they don't know they're going to have a job tomorrow, then they're less likely to be going out there and spending money. And similarly, those 15,000 fewer jobs in building and construction, well, that flows through into the services sector and into retail and hospitality, and it has a big knock-on effect. So what the government have done is taken what was a challenging time for the country, no question, but they've made it so much worse than it needed to be. We could have been well on the road to recovery by now if the government hadn't decided to do the slash and burn that they did. They talk a big game on infrastructure. What have they done? In reality, they've reduced the amount of money that we're spending on infrastructure. Right at the time when we should be keeping people in work in those areas, they're driving them to Australia.
We are three huge, sparsely populated islands. Free market dynamics don't work when you have such low population density, which is why the state of New Zealand has always needed to be the 35% to 40% foundation stone. Why is this government hell-bent on rescinding the state's obligations and simply leaving it to the free market?
Oh, this is the government that we've seen in New Zealand's recent history that's the most committed to the neoliberal way of thinking about the economy. But also this arbitrary restriction on the size of government. Let's go to the capitalist capital of the world, the United States. And some of the biggest advances in technology that have happened in the US in my lifetime have been because the government supported it. Many people will be watching this on an iPhone or an iPad or a flat screen. Well, actually, the technology behind that was funded by government. Private sector businesses have commercialized it, but the government funded the R&D behind it. Every time you use GPS, every time you use Siri or Alexa or one of those voice-activated technologies, you're using technology that governments have helped to support. And this idea that if we just shrink the size of government, everything will get better. Let's talk about the real world experience of that. The reality is the opposite happens.
When it was the Treaty Principles referendum, every academic, expert, iwi and critic were all wrong and only David Seymour was right. Now it's the Regulatory Standards Bill and lo and behold, every academic, expert, iwi and critic are all wrong again. Only David is right. Is it fair that David Seymour has so much self-esteem when the people his policies hurt have so little ego?
Well, if you want an example of just how ridiculous this has become for the government, they are now actively investigating whether they will need to provide compensation to Bitcoin bros in the event that they ban Bitcoin ATM machines. It is now that absurd. You'll get a situation where anti-smoking situations, where we do things to reduce smoking, will have to compensate the tobacco companies for it. This is how absurd life is becoming in David Seymour's view of the world. And Christopher Luxon is allowing him to do this. The Prime Minister has no control over his own government. Winston Peters, David Seymour, Shane Jones, they can do whatever they want, and Luxon seems to have no control over that whatsoever. You've now got Winston Peters and David Seymour slugging it out in public over whether David Seymour should be writing to the UN or not, and whether Christopher Luxon's allowed to have an opinion on that or not. This is now no longer a joke. This is New Zealand's international reputation that's being trashed.
Have you ever in your political life seen a letter sent from the New Zealand government to the UN that was that openly hostile?
Well, no, I haven't, but also I've not seen a situation where the Prime Minister then goes and retracts the letter but says that he agrees with it. Then the Minister of Foreign Affairs said the Prime Minister had no right to say that he agreed with the letter that David Seymour said. Who's actually in charge in this government? And why can't these people sit in a room together and figure out what New Zealand's position should be before they go embarrassing the country internationally? Because it's not the first time this has happened. You had Christopher Luxon jumping on a plane, bouncing around the world saying, I'm going to sort out the trade war. Little old New Zealand's going to resolve international trade and end the trade war. While Winston Peters is literally traveling around the world at the same time saying there is no trade war and this is all hysterical stuff. If you're another country looking at New Zealand, you'll be looking at us going, what? What has happened to New Zealand?
Right. ACT claim to be the party of free speech, yet have branded all critics of the Regulatory Standards Bill as victims of the day who suffer Regulatory Standards Bill derangement syndrome. How is publishing an enemies list of critics supporting free speech?
I mean, look, if you believe in free speech, you have to be willing to accept that people are going to call you out and particularly challenge you if you're wrong. David Seymour's wrong all of the time, and his solution is to personally denigrate and attack the people who are actually putting up good evidence-based arguments against the things that he's doing. If his arguments were so strong, why isn't he actually focused on the argument? Why is he trying to denigrate the people who are making legitimate, well-researched, well-informed arguments to say that what he's doing is wrong?
Chippy, we, the people, elect you, our representative, to decide on the laws of New Zealand. Why would we give corporate and polluter interests $20 million per year to vet legislation using a narrow libertarian interpretation of property rights over human rights?
I think that's exactly the point. The reality here is this bill tries to enshrine two sets of rights. You get a superior set of rights if you own property, and then you have lesser rights if you don't own property. There was a time in New Zealand where you had to own property in order to be able to vote in elections.
Right.
We did away with that generations ago. That thinking should be banished to previous centuries. It has no place in modern New Zealand. Everybody shouldn't have their rights determined by whether or not they have money or whether or not they have property. That is just the wrong way of thinking about everything. It's the reason that I have been very proud to say repeatedly since David Seymour introduced this bill into Parliament, we will repeal it as one of the first things we do when we're back in government.
Amen. Amen. Finally, Chris, Tamaki Makaurau by-election. What do Māori voters want from Labour?
I think that what we've been hearing from Māori voters is they want us to focus on the things that affect everybody, like jobs, health, homes, real action on the cost of living, making sure that we've got strong voices for Māori around the decision-making table here in Wellington. And that's exactly what we'll be campaigning on. Peeni Henare has sat around the cabinet table. I think he only missed out by the narrowest of margins last time. Yeah. And I think we owe it to those people who voted for him last time to give them another chance to back him to be back there as their local MP.
Preach. Thank you, comrades. Speak to you next month. Cheers, Chippy.
Good as gold. Great to talk to you, Bomber.
Be well, mate. Okay, now to our political panel all-stars. Our first panellist is the only reason you would buy a subscription to the New Zealand Herald. Militant cyclist and Auckland visionary, Simon Wilson. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show. One word to describe the week, please, sir.
Oh, I'm going to say 0.00001. And the reason I'm going to say that is that you introduced at the top of the hour, you introduced the show talking about the 1% and the 9% against everybody else. I think this idea that the 1% is the problem is a little bit out of date. Billionaires are not 1% of the world's population. Billionaires are the 0.0000.
It's true.
But they have an extraordinary influence on the one hand, and on the other, they have an extraordinary ability to make change for the better if they want to.
Yes.
So on both counts, they are the people who are really the problem and the corporates that they run. And it's not the 1%, it's that tiny group that we like to think is just part of being wealthy. They're not wealthy, they are mega wealthy, and they are doing such damage.
Our next panellist is a doyen of the political reporting world. We're so lucky and grateful to have Claudette Hawati, the Wātea's press gallery journalist, coming to us live from Wellington. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show. One word to describe the week, please, ma'am.
Me tuku mihi kia koutou katoa. One word, trenches. We're in the trenches and we're hunkering down. Trenches. That's my kupu tuatahi.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, she's House of Gryffindor, Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw all rolled into one. Recreational Jedi Knight and one of the best public academics in Aotearoa, Law Professor Jane Kelsey. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show. One word to describe the week, please, ma'am.
Oh, kia ora. I don't know if I've even read the book you're referring to there.
It's all good. It's all good.
You say that in all the lectures.
Okay. Well, my one word, I'm sad to say, I'm sure it's been used here before, is genocide.
Yes. Very sad.
And
Thank
when
you.
is our government going to stand up and have a voice and not put us to shame when people ask what we're doing in Aotearoa?
Preach, thank you. Tonight's political panel topics are Issue 1, 30,000 Kiwis leave in 1 year. Is the economy in recession and what is the government doing about it? Issue 2, the Regulatory Standards Bill. Who is this actually for and will it create economic growth? And Issue 3 tonight, the COVID inquiry, legitimate attempt to learn from past mistakes or a politicised weapon to attack Jacinda with. Let's begin tonight with news that 30,000 Kiwis left New Zealand while the latest economic data is threatening that we are already in recession. What happened to growth? Who is it growing for? Claudette, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon and Finance Minister Nicola Willis said through the first 6 months of the year, their government and budget 2025 was focused on growth. But the Crown accounts for the 11 months to the end of May actually show the government invested $6.4 billion less than last year and $3.6 billion less than forecast. Where's the growth?
In terms of the growth around housing, as an example, 200 whare in Te Tai Tukurau have now been stopped. They've been canned. Those were the whare that were to be built by Kāinga Ora. So in terms of employment, we've also got mai whānau who are now without mahi because they were in the building industry. There's also a significant number of our rangatahi who had entered trade training. It was part of the Provincial Growth Fund with under the Labour government and Shane Jones and New Zealand First to get our nefs off the couch. So that was all to drive up the economy, employment, to ramp up housing. They've stopped that, they've cut that, and now we've got mass unemployment, rising unemployment amongst our rangatahi. So the growth, I don't know where the growth is, but also too, in terms of, just looking at that RSB, that's also looking at whenua Māori to see whether or not there is some ability to utilise that for some commercial purposes, whether it's investigating, mining or offshore drilling around some of our takutai. So we're very much right in the centre of this growth policy at the pointy end where we will be negatively impacted by this growth policy of the coalition government. So where's this growth policy? I don't know, because you can't see it on the streets of Clinton Park and Marurewa. You can't see it on the streets of Porirua either.
Follow-up question. The services sector, which makes up about 2/3 of our GDP, contracted for the 5th consecutive month in June. How much longer will voters accept the government's "we're cleaning up after Jacinda's mess" as an excuse?
So the Prime Minister even used that again today on the tiles,
That's
and
right.
so did Minister for Finance, Nicola Willis. She used that again. Well, we are trying to mop up after the last Labor government. So I really do want to emphasise the fact that our whānau are doing it tough on the street. So when it comes time for interest rates or, the international markets that impact on us, regardless of whether that goes up or whether it goes down, there will still be a significant number of our whānau who are doing it tough. Now, when we see that the market isn't, or the economy doesn't suit us, that it is impacting us negatively when we see the number of our whānau out there on the streets. I mean, that's the human face of the bad economic policies of this government. You can talk as many facts and figures and data and percentage points as you like, but when you turn around on the streets in Rotorua, in some of our CBDs, that is the human face of those swings and balances and all those percentage points.
Simon, the government portrayed the 0.8% rise in the first quarter as the beginning of the recovery. We were told growth, but it's the government's own amputation of state spending that has stunted that for ideological reasons. Are there any Keynesians left on the political right, or is it all Doge, chainsaw, taxpayers union wet dreams? What is it?
I think you might find it is veering to the latter. One of the things that's extraordinary about this constant refrain that we need growth,
yes,
and we need more productivity and all the rest, is that it's simply the thing that has always been said by governments on the centre left and centre right for a very long time, and very little happens about it. We had today released in Auckland the third annual State of the City report, which said exactly what the previous two had said, which was that Auckland, which ought to be a technological leader in the economy, is falling behind, and everybody rubs their hands and frets and goes, oh my goodness, what are we going to do about this? When actually there are things right in front of them that could be done. There could be a proper drive towards a higher wage economy, which would make an enormous difference to the number of people immigrating. There could be a serious uptake on the existing new technologies, if we're going to talk about tech, to help with transport, and I'm thinking about light rail, surface light rail. With housing, and I'm thinking about prefabrication, which has been not a success in this country so far, and you have to think, why is that? Why has it not got the wraparound support it needs to make it happen properly? There could be a really serious attempt to say, okay, we don't have enough energy capacity for what we need, and instead of talking about we've got to get the base load right, as if the base load is somehow fossil fuels, there could be a proper attempt to say, okay, solar and wind are going to be much more important for us.
Right.
The government actually has policies for urban solar and rural solar, but they're mild, slow, and doing very little, and it's extraordinary. And the big example to me about the problem with the way people talk about a high-tech, high-functioning economy and do so little. If you look at Fonterra moved a couple of years ago in Auckland from wherever it was down to the Wynyard Quarter, into a flash new Green Star building. It's so energy efficient. It's a fabulous place. Everybody can ride a bicycle to get there if they want, public transport, etc. They feel really good about living in a modern, progressive part of the city. That's how they see it. But at the same time, they restructured themselves to focus on commodity exports, which is just the most absurd contradiction.
Follow-up question. Dina Boney reports today that the government is trumpeting the fact that 215 applications have so far been received for the rejigged golden visa categories, with $1 billion in new money landing this year if all those who applied are approved. Is that what we've become? A country selling citizenship to multi-millionaires. Is that how far we've fallen?
You don't think that worked with Peter Thiel?
I mean, it's outrageous. We're selling citizenship, aren't we?
Yeah, and there is very little serious attempt to structure the economy the way they say we should be restructuring. It's not like it's a radical idea that nobody in government is talking about. They are talking about it. They're just not doing it.
Professor Kelsey, the government shut down public housing builds, infrastructure, and literally, I'm not metaphorically, literally robbed $12 billion in pay parity workers to give to bosses. How much of the predictable economic recession is because of their ideological policies?
Well, we've been down that track before and we've seen what the consequences were in terms of inequality, but we're also seeing the legacy in terms of lack of genuine investment, social infrastructure investment, environmental and energy investment. And what happens when you let rip the finance sector, or when you let rip the supermarket duopolies and so on. And in a sense, this is just a continuation, an extremity of that. But I think if I'm looking at that, at the rhetoric that we're having now, and I go to what Claudia was saying about people on the streets, and I work, of course, in the trade area quite a bit. I mean, we're a country that is swimming in logs, right? And
so to speak. It's dangerous.
And it's very dangerous. But what have we seen in the last few weeks? We've seen a couple of hundred people in well-paid working class jobs at Tokeroa laid off.
Yes.
We've had another couple of hundred in Okura at 2 mills there laid off. We've had almost another 100 at Penrose. And why? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is the bizarrely unpredictable energy markets that make it impossible for many businesses, big businesses, to operate. But also because we have allowed foreign investors to come and buy up logs and ship them offshore. We have similar to what Simon was saying about Fonterra, we have this low value added economy where we are, like many countries in the global south, exporting the raw materials where the value add is made somewhere else. We've signed up to international trade agreements that say that we can't require foreign investors, when they invest in the forests, to do local processing here. And there was a really good report from the Productivity Commission before it got disbanded by this government, which actually talked about how do we develop a resilient economy. And it was partly informed by the COVID experiences and so on, the problems with supply chains and the like. And so there was, I understand, in the forestry sector, for example, some planning that had been done in the last, terrible word, that in the last government, to try to find ways to build that innovative domestic capacity. And we've lost all of that conversation now. So I'm very interested. I'm always a sceptic. I'm sorry, Chippy, I'm a sceptic about whether Labor, in fact, will bite the bullet and do those things, because they haven't to date. But if we're going to make a difference, and if we're going to find a way to reverse some of the social and economic and ecological harm, especially to Māori in this country, then they are going to have to do that.
Right. Follow-up question. Critics point to the lack of vision in the recent steep budget cuts, but misunderstand that for Nicola Willis, the steep budget cuts is the economic vision, isn't it?
Is there even a vision? I mean, it's a deep concern that we have the recycling of the proven failures of the past. And as someone who's written multiple books about failures, we were actually having a conversation at Simon's birthday party on Saturday night. Happy birthday, Simon.
Oh, thank you.
About what happened to all of the work that we'd done during the Rogernomics Ruthanasia period. It's as if it's gone up in flames, and there's not the same fire in the belly of the journalists and the academics and the activists yes, it's around issues, but not around systemic stuff.
I think that it's a little more sinister than the cuts are the vision. I've been writing about housing in Mount Roskill today for a piece that will come out tomorrow in the Herald. In Mount Roskill, there are lots of new kāinga ora developments, and some of them were so far developed that they are finished or are close to finishing, and that's fine. But a lot of them weren't, and they've been stopped. And there's a street in Mount Roskill that has the most wonderful community garden set up by a church, supported by the council. It's just fabulous, and it's an emblem of strength of community and what you get when people in a neighbourhood feel bonded together. In that neighbourhood, a whole lot of houses have been ripped out, taken away. A whole lot more are boarded up, and one of them at least has been burnt out, because Kāinga Ora was midway through the process of developing that neighbourhood to be better, brighter. They moved out the tenants. They were going to bring them back. The tenants kept their kids in the same schools. It was all difficult, but they were going to bring them back and re-establish the community. All of that's been stopped. And at the same time, the infrastructure was already done. So under the ground, all the work's been done, and these properties are going to now be sold off. Now, there's your agenda. This infrastructure-ready land is going to be sold to private developers instead of the state doing it, and they will make money out of it. And at the same time, the government is lowering the standards of what a decent house is, so they'll be able to build more cheaply, because Kāinga Ora, by making all its homes Homestar 6, raised the standard of basic housing in this country.
That's right, they did.
It was a remarkable success story. That is gone. So private developers will be buying cheaply land that's ready for development. They will be building cheaper houses and making a killing on them. And on top of that, again, it's quite likely that in an election year the government's going to say, we need to buy some of those so we can make it look as if we are actually got social housing, and the developers will win again on that. There's your agenda, enabling the private sector to benefit off the state.
Claudette, the Performance of Services Index and the Performance of Manufacturing Index all suggest an economy already in recession. At what point do you think National reverses course and starts reinvesting?
I think when they get more international investors in place and line them up, and then we'll see a reversal of this. So it's not just in our housing space, but it's also in hospitals as well too, driving down the number of, just today there was an example of hospitals ramping up doctors' appointments so that they could fudge the numbers. So we're seeing a degradation of our health system alongside our housing system. And this is at the same time that the government is also ramping up the investment attraction of the investors following that investors summit a few months ago. So I think that they're putting their ducks in a line, and when they are ready to have those international investors come on board, then we're going to see, the government, the coalition government has suddenly seen, turned the economy around. Also, too, it's eroding as well. So we're seeing a lot of investors hanging around that space. So they're right across all of the infrastructure and housing, and they're looking at their lands as well, too. And I would suggest that the only thing that's stopping the multi-investor investors from coming in and large-scale development and buy-up are iwi and treaty settlements.
Right.
I think they are very, very focused on their treaty settlements, maintaining those settlements that have already been done, and looking at those iwi and hapu that are yet to settle. And particularly in Te Tai Tokerau, I think that there is a really big effort by Ngā Hapu or Ngāpuhi to ensure that they safeguard those resources that are yet to come under their settlement.
Simon, is there a twisted irony watching extreme weather events impact our economy while this government continues to cut money away from climate budgets?
Oh, there absolutely is. And we're meant to be taking seriously at the moment the idea that councils should be getting back to the basics and not wasting their money on nice to haves.
Civil defence are nice to have?
Councils now, the main issue, the main natural disaster issue facing most councils, and certainly in Auckland, is flooding, and it faces them frequently. And we know why it is. The argument is should really only be how we deal with it. It's an enormously difficult complex problem because there is no end. It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse.
That's right.
And the public tolerance for public money to be paid out for other people to be rescued is going to quite possibly reduce, even though
they will want to be rescued.
I
if
want
something
to be rescued when it happens to me, and I
yes.
demand it because I've been paying my taxes and been paying my rates. There is no good answer to that, so we need a very cohesive social debate about it. We need to be engaged in it, and we need to recognise that money needs to be spent. And so just to be arguing that the problem with councils is that they're wasting our money is absurd when we should be talking about how do we focus on the big resilience and mitigation issues. We can't just be saying
that's right.
we're going to build seawalls and all the rest. We've also got to be saying how do we stop this continuing.
Professor Kelsey, Newsroom reported yesterday that New Zealand will block the controversial mechanism allowing private corporations to sue governments for being added to a 15-nation Asia-Pacific trade deal. Is the government finally listening to you about the dangers of investor-state dispute settlement clauses? Are they?
Well, I actually have to give credit to Winston here.
Oh, bless old Winston. I know. You feel conflicted.
Is that her?
You feel conflicted.
Yeah, but yeah, of course, it was a long campaign that a lot of people internationally have
Which you
have run.
spearheaded. You spearheaded in New Zealand.
But we also need to see it in a not so happy context. Yes, National has followed Labour and New Zealand First in saying they will not support the right of foreign investors to sue governments.
Thank God.
Well, but hold on.
Yep.
We have also just renewed investor-state dispute settlement in an agreement that involves the 10 ASEAN countries and Australia we have an arrangement with.
Yeah.
We have ISDS with a significant number of other countries. And let me just give you one example of where the current problem is, and it goes back to the climate discussion you've just been having. There is an Australian billionaire called Clive Palmer,
Yes.
fifth richest racist Australian.
Pretty awful.
He has a company called Mineralogy, which does critical minerals mining and all the new stuff as well as all the old dirty stuff, operates here. He had a number of disputes in Australia, lost those disputes, incorporated here thinking he could sue Australia from here under an investment and discovered, actually, no, this is actually the one relationship where we don't have that operating, has gone to Singapore now, has incorporated in Singapore, is suing Australia for $420 billion in 4 disputes.
How much?
$420 billion under...
I told you these people are the problem.
Under the agreement that we have just renewed with ASEAN. And so he is an operator in this country, could easily do the same thing. So this policy, really good. Will it make a difference? No.
Quick round. The unemployment rate is currently 5.1% and 10.5% for Māori. Where will they be in December, Claudette?
Where will our unemployed be in December?
What will the numbers be?
Oh, look, it'll be up at around between 12 and 15% at this rate.
For Māori, you mean, or overall?
No, for Māori.
Yes.
Well, for Māori, would we up around 12 to 15%? Just shy, but about that. That's what our figures state.
Yeah. Simon, where we're going to be unemployment rate December?
Well, I think Claudette is probably right about that. And overall unemployment, it's only crept so far, but there's going to it's quite a real risk now there'll be a dam breaking. Yeah, I think.
Professor Kelsey?
It depends on how many go to Australia. And literally, we were told in Kinleith that a travel agent in Kinleith was offering cheap one-way fares to those who've been made redundant in a positive attempt to be positive and helpful. And so that's our response.
Yeah. Comrades, we need to move on to issue 2 tonight, and that is the Regulatory Standards Bill. Who is this actually for, and will it create economic growth? Professor Kelsey, you wrote an open letter with a long list of recognisable and serious intellectuals warning to stop the undemocratic Regulatory Standards Bill. What are your concerns?
Well, first we have to recognise this is the 4th run of the same Act Business Roundtable promoted bill, only able to get up this time because of the backdoor dealings in the coalition agreement. It is really interesting to see that even ACT doesn't seem to know what the bill is for. So Bryce Wilkinson, who was the architect of it in the early days, is out there saying, oh, this is a big beat up. This is just about transparency. It's only about transparency. It's nothing to do with property rights, etc. Whilst behind the scenes he's been lobbying the officials to make sure that the basic principle on not taking private property is right centre in the bill. Seymour, by contrast, doesn't say it's about transparency and nothing to worry about. He said in the introductory debate in the House, Jane Kelsey says this bill is about private property rights and wealth. Well, Jane, you finally got it right.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we have, as we heard from Chris Hipkins, ACT coming out and saying a ban on crypto ATMs. She's seeking advice as to whether they have to compensate those setting up those money laundering machines.
For criminals, yes.
And then we had Seymour saying that breaking up the supermarket duopoly is going to breach their private property rights.
Yep.
And so you don't even need to have this enforceable in the courts. It's what we call the chilling effect.
Yes.
And especially because this board that was going to be set up, appointed by the minister, who at present, of course, is Seymour, and which will involve all his fellow travellers of the ones that he's consulted on the bill, Graham Scott, Bryce Wilkinson, legal advice from Jack Hodder and so on, they can initiate themselves or receive complaints about breaches of these principles, including property rights, and completely tie up the entire decision-making process.
With more red tape.
And then get officials to back off that because they just haven't got the resources and the time. And then, to go back to your earlier question about investor-state dispute settlement, investors are going to be able to say our legitimate expectation was that you were going to apply these principles, including compensation for impairing our property rights, and bring investment disputes in offshore tribunals if they happen to be from a country that has such an agreement with New Zealand, or they do the boomerang thing that Clive Palmer's done and go and invest there. And so, I mean, I don't know that National even understands what the consequences of this will be for its supposed free market policies.
Yeah.
And hopefully Winston
Fingers crossed.
is actually going to take his battle with Mr. Seymour into the regulatory standards bill space.
Claudette, former politicians, lawyers, unions, environmentalists, iwi, academics, Treaty of Waitangi campaigners, church groups, health groups, local and regional councils and state-owned enterprises all viciously criticised this legislation. Is this another case of everyone else is wrong and David Seymour is right?
And the UN also disagreed and criticised the bill as well too.
Right.
And then Seymour has the audacity to write a letter and then tells us all that they are insane, that the rapporteur from the UN is insane. And then he goes and gets a slap back from Winston Peters, who says, I am the foreign minister and I will write the letter, and then basically says that he absolutely disagrees with Seymour. So yes, it's not just Te Ao Māori and everyone here in Aotearoa that is wrong, but it's also the UN, international experts on human rights and Indigenous issues, are also wrong. So I'm not 100% sure what you call that type of ahua or that type of attitude where maybe it's a God complex, I'm not sure, but it is very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, we can laugh about them as much as we like, but in actual fact, this is dangerous policy. And I want to quote Maya Tehira from Sykes & Co., the law firm, when she said it is the most reviled, resurrected, it's the bill that won't die. It's reviled, it's been rejected, it's been resurrected, and now we're seeing it back on the table simply because, now not her words, my words, simply because we've got a weak as shit Prime Minister that allows this kind of stuff to get back. Now, Winston Peters was asked today what he thinks of the RSB. He says that his party has been working on it for quite a few months now to make amendments to that. So what are we going to see then? What do we take from that? He's going to pass that RSB with amendments. So we're going to see whether or not that Tainer of his, Seymour, will accept those amendments. But it will pass in some form.
Simon, critics claim the Regulatory Standards Bill is a neoliberal Trojan horse that will allow polluter interests and corporations to influence our laws to ensure property rights are put ahead of human rights. Are those critics right?
That's pretty much the notes I wrote down. I think what we're seeing here, if you think about the international rules-based order, which is a phrase that everybody has trotted out in response to Donald Trump, how he's trashing it. International rules-based order was invented by neoliberals and was used for decades very successfully as a way of making the world wonderfully profitable for international corporates.
Yeah.
At the expense of states very often. But it's not good enough for them now. That's run its course, and what we are seeing now with this bill, but also in a wider context internationally, is a real fight to restructure the economic order to make the world even more profitable for those corporates working in the way they do.
Right.
Yeah. So that's my reading of it. But that's what's actually going on. And ACT, of course, in New Zealand are their spearhead.
Local franchise holders in the free market.
And I think one of the things, because Claudette's referred a couple of times to the mess of the coalition, and you're absolutely right. She is right about that. But I wonder whether that's a model that we're going to see quite a lot more of, that when you have a coalition of 2 or 3 parties that are strongly opposed to each other in various ways, prime ministers are going to look for ways to let all that happen as long as it doesn't undermine what they regard as their core interests. And I think that's how you can read Luxon at the moment, that he is not upset about the way in which Winston does this and Seymour does that, because it's not undermining the core things that he or his party are trying to do.
Comrades, we need to move on to issue 3 tonight, and that is the COVID inquiry set up by New Zealand First to capture the anti-vax electorate. Is the COVID inquiry a legitimate attempt to learn or a politicised weapon to attack Jacinda with? Claudette, you are down in Parliament. What is the feeling of the inquiry?
So, it's very quiet. Actually, I've got to say, very quiet on the tiles. Not a lot of kōrero discussion around this, but there is a sense that, on the one hand, that anything that allows, the community to have their say whether they liked it or not is a good thing. Having said that, though, who has been invited to have their say? Yeah, that is something that, we actually don't know. Jacinda has said that she will be available to kōrero with the with this committee. And yes, there is a hardcore group of those actually outside of the Beltway that are targeting her, and I think it has been politically there's a political motivation behind that, which is, I think, quite destructive in terms of both inquiries, the first one and now the second one. It's unfortunate that our whānau on the ground, Māori and Pasifika, who worked in those jobs that kept the country running, their voices have not been heard at either the first and now the second one. So I think the learnings that we could have, and yet there were some great things that happened, but there were always learnings. Those learnings should be coming from those whānau who
paid the
kept
price.
the country running.
You're absolutely right. Simon Ryanbridge, Paddy Gower and Sir Ian Taylor are all playing Captain Hindsight now, but you remember the fear when COVID first struck. Should we allow revisionist history to sell our collective sacrifice so cheaply?
I'm both worried and I want to be hopeful about this. It is really extraordinary. I mean, it's not surprising at all that there is a group of people who are using this to simply breathe new life into their campaign of hatred against Jacinda Ardern, which is a disgusting thing to watch, and it is being given far too much credibility, as if they speak for a lot of people. I don't believe that, but they're getting their day again. So that's happening. There are a whole lot of other people who can remember the fear and can remember the financial hardship, can remember how hard it was health-wise. They can remember that they couldn't go to their grandparents' funeral and all of those things. And that's what they remember. And they're real things, and they caused real pain, and they still cause real pain. But that's all that's being reported or remembered or reported to the inquiry now. And that's a real shame because there was so much more of it. But on the other hand, if this inquiry becomes a way in which the people running it can elevate the debate, can use this as a kind of pressure valve, and can try to bring those discordant voices, not bring them all together, but to allow the pain to be expressed in order to say, okay, and now we move on, because as Chris Hipkins told us earlier this evening, not only did we have one of the best health outcomes in the world, we also had one of the fewest numbers of days of lockdowns, and we had one of the best economic outcomes.
Exactly.
And if we can move up to that level out of this, that would be tremendous. Whether we'll do it, I don't know.
Professor Kelsey, Jacinda broke the cardinal rule of capitalism. She put public health ahead of profit margins. Her legacy must be destroyed in case it inspires other politicians. Yes?
Yes, and I don't disagree with any of the discussions about the lessons that need to be learnt, but there are some lessons that are not on the table. And there are two of them. Maybe the first one will get addressed, and that's how do we deal with misinformation and disinformation in social media? And I often reflect on the TPPA campaign where things weren't as far out of control as they are now. And we always were trying to keep, how do we make sure that there is accuracy in the information people are getting? Totally. And I think we need to be really trying to come to grips with that. And of course, if we try to regulate that, that's another regulatory takings under the Regulatory Standards Bill. But the second is, and there's a resonance here with what's happening with Pharmac, one of the biggest problems we had right at the start was that the monopoly rights on patents for pharmaceuticals and PPE, which are courtesy of the World Trade Organization rules, meant that there was a scarcity and there was a very high cost, so that generics producers couldn't produce to both the scale and the price that would have had a real impact. And New Zealand, unfortunately, has been lost in action in the discussions to try to reform these agreements in the international trade space. And we will continue to face those problems. Similarly, as we do with Pharmac, we're saying we need to spend more on the drugs. Well, actually, no, we need to deal with the drug companies.
Preach. Comrades, we need to wrap the show with a final word. Simon, your final word this week, please.
I just want to say that I like the idea of hope, and I particularly like it because at the moment in the world there are some things I think that politically should really give us hope. And one of them is Zoran Mamdani, who is the Democratic candidate for New York mayor, an actual socialist, a Muslim socialist in New York, who has done extraordinarily well, and it will be fascinating to see whether he manages to hold off the enormous power of the Democratic establishment who won't like it, but maybe he will. Maybe he really will, and that's fantastic. It was terrific to see in Britain that the backbenchers of the Labour Party rose up against the welfare cuts that were being proposed in their budget, and they won.
Yes.
These things can happen in the world if people fight hard enough.
Claudette, your final word this week, please.
I just want to encourage our whānau in Tamaki, Makaurau to go to the polls. Aha ko he tautoko te pāti reipa me te pāti Māori. Hari atu koe ki te mau tō mema parimata I tēnei rā, I tēnei tau. Nā reira, mihi atu ki a koutou katoa ki te haere ki te pōti, and congratulations to both of those members, Peni Henare and Orani Kaipara. But whānau, we got to get out and we got to vote.
Professor Kelsey, your final word this week?
I want to encourage everybody in the lead up to the election to actually debate the state of our constitution, not only around Te Tiriti o Waitangi, but around what has happened with the travesty of the MMP system, the way that the coalition deals and the timelines and the bizarre select committee processes where you're given 5 minutes to present a submission. All of that stuff has to start being challenged, and there is going to be a standing orders review. Standing Orders Committee will start a review of at least the parliamentary processes in a couple of months' time. So there needs to be a real push for some attempt to get some legitimacy on the total farce that we have in the parliamentary regime at present.
Preach. Thank you, comrades. And now to my final word. Brothers and sisters, can we all please pause and consider what the government has done for the Aussie banks this week? If you or I make a mistake with IRD, WINS, MSD, or the local council, they gleefully rip you to shreds without mercy, like a great white shark in a kindergarten pool during swim time. Yet two of the Aussie banks, ASB and ANZ, made mistakes that cost us, their clients, over $500 million. And this government is ramming through a retrospective law to give them cuddles. Why is it that we, the people, get merciless great white shark feeding frenzy routine when we make a mistake, but the Aussie banks screw us for $600 million and they get a retrospective cuddle from the government? Mungo no understand. You and me get the full Monty bash, but the two Australian banks get a cuddle and told they will have laws passed to retrospectively let them off the hook. The banks who make $1 billion profit. The banks whose job it is to know how and why they are charging you. The banks who took $600 million off us, their poor customers. Why did the rich get cuddles from this government, yet we, the poor, keep getting the stick? Comrades, at some point, you're going to have to acknowledge that your post-COVID bitterness towards Jacinda does not justify any of this. In solidarity, the revolution continues. Ka pai Aotearoa.
The Bradbury Group, New Zealand's best weekly political argument. The Bradbury Group is an independent podcast through the Rover Network, sponsored by Wātea News. After the show, the Bradbury Group enjoys conviviality at 165 Ponsonby Road. Why not pop down, meet the show staff and plot the revolution? That's 165 Ponsonby Road, Tuesday night drinking at its best. Everything on the show is an opinion and shouldn't be taken seriously enough to attempt defamation action against us. We were joking. We're never serious about anything. And officially, a small wetter in Avondale is legally the owner. Good luck finding him. Don't forget to follow, like and comment.